Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing into one of Africa's most unexpected stories. Picture this: American freed slaves crossing the Atlantic in the 1820s to establish what would become the continent's oldest republic. Sounds like historical fiction, doesn't it? Well, settle in, because Liberia's journey from coastal settlement to modern democracy is stranger and more fascinating than any novel. We're about to explore a country that's been called America's stepchild in Africa, a place where southern plantation architecture meets tropical rainforests, where indigenous kingdoms encountered American settlers, and where the world's largest rubber plantation shaped a nation's destiny. From the fever-ridden early colonies to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's Nobel Prize, this is a story of dreams, disasters, and surprising resilience. If you're curious about the hidden connections between American and African history, hit that subscribe button now, because the Atlas Archives specializes in the stories that textbooks somehow forgot to mention. Trust me, by the end of tonight's journey, you'll never think about Liberia the same way again. So grab your favorite evening beverage, find that perfect spot for drifting off, and let's begin our exploration of the land they called the Love of Liberty. Chapter 1: The Land of Liberty, Geography and Climate. Liberia stretches along the Atlantic coast for about 370 miles, which is roughly the distance from New York City to Richmond, Virginia. Though the journey here involves considerably more palm trees and significantly fewer rest stops selling questionable coffee, the country covers approximately 43,000 square miles, making it slightly smaller than Pennsylvania but infinitely more likely to have monkeys chattering in your backyard. The coastline itself is a masterpiece of geographical contradiction. On one hand, you have these magnificent sandy beaches that would make any tourist brochure jealous. On the other hand, you have a coastline so notoriously difficult to navigate that sailors historically referred to it as the Grain Coast, not because it was particularly agricultural, but because of the grains of Malagueta pepper that grew there. It's rather like naming a street Pothole Avenue, technically accurate, but not exactly encouraging for visitors. Moving inland from the coast, the landscape rises in a series of plateaus that seem to have been designed by someone with a serious commitment to the concept of gradual. The coastal plains extend roughly 25 miles inland, a distance you could walk in a day if you were particularly determined and didn't mind arriving absolutely drenched in sweat. These plains sit at barely 50 feet above sea level, making them about as flat as a pancake that's been sat on by a particularly heavy elephant. Beyond these plains, the land begins its leisurely ascent toward the interior highlands. The elevation increases so gradually that you might not even notice you're climbing until you realize you can suddenly see over the trees and your ears haven't popped once. This is geography for people who prefer their mountain climbing to be more of a gentle suggestion than a life-threatening adventure. The highest point in Liberia is Mount Wutev, which reaches a respectable 4,724 feet above sea level. This makes it roughly half the height of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, but with significantly more tropical vegetation and fewer tourists in inappropriate footwear. Mount Wutev sits in the northwestern part of the country, in the WWII range, standing there like a modest person at a party who's actually quite interesting once you get to know them. The country's river system reads like a poem written by someone who really liked the letter S. You have the St. Paul River, which flows past Monrovia like an aquatic highway for dugout canoes and the occasional confused hippo. There's the St. John River, the Sestos River, and the Kavala River, which forms part of the border with Côte d'Ivoire and has probably witnessed more border disputes than a property line hedge between suburban neighbours. These rivers have carved the landscape like nature's own road-building crew, creating valleys that serve as natural pathways through what might otherwise be impenetrable forest. The St. Paul River in particular has been the nation's liquid lifeline, providing transportation, water, and presumably endless conversation topics for people who live along its banks. It's the kind of river that's been central to human civilization for so long that it probably has its own oral history tradition. Now, let's discuss the climate, which can best be described as aggressively tropical. Liberia sits squarely within the equatorial climate zone, which means it has mastered the art of being hot and humid, with the dedication of a yoga instructor who's perhaps a bit too enthusiastic about the heated studio. The average temperature hovers around 80 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, with humidity levels that make stepping outside feel like entering a steam room run by overachievers. The country experiences two distinct seasons, though calling them seasons is a bit like calling a tsunami a large wave, technically correct but missing some crucial nuance. There's the dry season, which runs from November to April, and the wet season, which occupies the remaining months with the enthusiasm of someone who's just discovered water balloons. During the dry season, rainfall drops to practically nothing, while the wet season can dump over 150 inches of rain annually on some parts of the country. To put that in perspective, 150 inches of rain is more than Seattle gets in an entire year, and Seattle is so famously rainy that people there have reportedly evolved webbed feet. The wet season in Liberia doesn't mess around. When it decides to rain, it commits to the project with the single-minded determination of a determined toddler with a garden hose. The harmattan winds provide the country's closest approximation to air conditioning, blowing in from the Sahara Desert during the dry season. These winds carry dust from the desert, creating a hazy atmosphere that photographers find either frustratingly challenging or mysteriously beautiful, depending on their artistic temperament. The harmattan essentially gives Liberia a temporary makeover, like Instagram's sepia filter applied by Mother Nature herself. This climate has created one of West Africa's most impressive rainforests, an ecosystem so rich and diverse that it makes tropical botany textbooks look like grocery lists. The Upper Guinea rainforest, which covers much of Liberia's interior, is home to over 2,000 plant species, including trees so tall they seem to be in personal competition with skyscrapers. Some of these trees have been standing for centuries, making them the botanical equivalent of those people who remember when television only had 3 channels. The forest canopy is so thick that walking beneath it feels like being inside a natural cathedral designed by an architect who really believed in the concept of mood lighting. Only about 2% of the sunlight actually reaches the forest floor, creating an environment that's perpetually cool and mysteriously dim. It's the kind of place where you expect to encounter either profound philosophical insights or possibly a hobbit, depending on your literary preferences. Within this forest ecosystem live some of Africa's most remarkable creatures. Liberia is home to forest elephants, which are smaller than their savanna cousins but make up for their size with increased intelligence and what appears to be superior problem-solving skills. These elephants have learned to navigate the forest with the precision of experienced subway commuters, following ancient paths that have been elephant highways longer than humans have been building actual highways. The country also hosts several species of primates, including chimpanzees who seem to have developed their own local customs and cultural traditions. Researchers have observed different chimp communities using tools in distinctly different ways, suggesting that even in the animal kingdom, regional differences in technique can spark debates that would fit right in at academic conferences. Liberia's coastal waters are equally impressive, serving as important breeding grounds for several species of sea turtles, who return to these beaches with the reliability of tourists returning to their favorite vacation spot. The leatherback turtle, in particular, treats Liberian beaches like a luxury maternity ward, arriving each year to lay eggs in the sand with the confidence of someone who's made reservations well in advance. The country's mineral wealth reads like a geology textbook's greatest hits. Iron ore deposits are scattered throughout the interior, particularly in the Nimba Mountains, where the ore is so high quality that it's been attracting international mining companies like a mineral-themed beacon. There's also gold, diamonds, and substantial deposits of rubber-producing trees that have played starring roles in Liberia's economic drama for over a century. The rubber trees deserve special mention because they've been both blessing and curse to the Liberian economy. Originally introduced from Brazil in the early 20th century, these trees adapted to Liberian soil so successfully that they practically sent thank you notes to the local agricultural department. However, their success also made Liberia dependent on a single crop export, which is a bit like betting your entire paycheck on one horse. Exciting when it works, problematic when it doesn't. Liberia's location has made it a crossroads of Atlantic maritime traffic for centuries. Ships travelling between Europe and the rest of West Africa often stop here for supplies, repairs, or simply to remind their crews what solid ground feels like. The deep-water port at Monrovia has been handling international shipping since the 19th century, making it the marine equivalent of a truck stop that somehow evolved into a small city. The country's 15 counties each have their own geographical personalities. Grand Bassa County, for instance, is known for its particularly productive agricultural land, while Lofa County in the north specializes in being mountainous and mysterious. Sino County has beaches so pristine they look like computer screensavers, while Grand Gede County contains forests so dense that Google Earth probably gives up trying to map the details. Each county reflects the broader geographical themes that make Liberia unique. The constant negotiation between coast and interior, between tradition and modernity, between the practical needs of human settlement and the overwhelming presence of nature that seems determined to reclaim any space left unattended for more than 5 minutes. As we prepare to delve deeper into this remarkable country's history, it's worth remembering that geography is destiny in ways both obvious and subtle. The very coastline that made Liberia accessible to American colonists in the 19th century also made it vulnerable to the complex currents of international politics. The forests that provided wealth also provided hiding places for armies. The rivers that connected communities also divided them. The seasonal patterns that govern life in Liberia operate with the reliability of a well-wound clock, though one that occasionally decides to run fast or slow just to keep things interesting. The transition between dry and wet seasons doesn't happen gradually like a dimmer switch, but rather like someone flipping a light switch while simultaneously opening a fire hydrant. One day you're dealing with dusty roads and the constant need for sunglasses, and the next day you're watching the same roads transform into temporary rivers that seem genuinely surprised to find themselves full of water. During the height of the wet season, typically in July and August, the country receives rainfall that would impress even the most dedicated meteorologist. Thunderstorms arrive with the dramatic flair of actors who've been waiting backstage for their big scene, complete with lightning that illuminates the entire sky and thunder that sounds like the world's largest drum kit falling down several flights of stairs. These storms don't merely rain, they perform rain, with the enthusiasm of a Broadway musical number. The agricultural implications of this climate are both blessing and challenge. The abundant rainfall and fertile soil make Liberia capable of growing almost anything, from rice and cassava to cocoa and coffee. Farmers here don't worry about drought. They worry about too much rain washing away their crops or flooding their fields at precisely the wrong moment. It's the agricultural equivalent of having a neighbour who's incredibly generous but has absolutely no sense of timing. Rice paddies dot the countryside like nature's own mirrors, reflecting the sky during the rainy season and providing habitat for an impressive variety of birds who seem to have figured out that hanging around rice fields is an excellent life strategy. The traditional method of rice cultivation involves flooding fields in intricate patterns that would make ancient Roman engineers envious, creating terraced landscapes that are both functional and beautiful. The country's biodiversity extends far beyond the charismatic megafauna. Liberia hosts over 600 bird species, including several that exist nowhere else on Earth. The forest is home to butterflies so colourful they look like flying stained glass windows, and insects so varied that entomologists probably need separate filing systems just to keep track of them all. There are frogs that change colour based on their mood, which is either an evolutionary advantage or nature's version of mood rings, depending on your perspective. Plant life in Liberia operates on a scale that seems designed to humble human ambitions. Vines grow so enthusiastically that they can cover entire buildings in a matter of months, leading to the ongoing battle between human infrastructure and vegetation that appears determined to reclaim every square inch of cleared land. It's not uncommon to see abandoned structures that have been so thoroughly embraced by plant life that they look like they're wearing elaborate green costumes. The medicinal properties of Liberian plants have been recognized for centuries, with traditional healers maintaining knowledge passed down through generations about which leaves treat of which ailments, and which roots should absolutely never be consumed under any circumstances. Modern pharmaceutical research has begun to validate many of these traditional uses, though the process moves considerably slower than the traditional healers who've been successfully treating patients for decades. Liberia's geographic position has also made it a crucial stopping point for migrating species. Whales pass along the coast during their seasonal journeys, occasionally providing impromptu entertainment for coastal residents who happen to be in the right place at the right time. Migratory birds use the country as a rest stop during their transcontinental flights, turning certain areas into temporary avian airports complete with all the noise and chaos you'd expect. The geological history of the region is written in the rocks and soils that have attracted both scientists and miners for generations. Some of the rock formations date back over 2 billion years, making them older than most philosophical concepts and certainly older than any human attempt to understand what they've witnessed. These ancient rocks have seen the rise and fall of species, the movement of continents, and probably the development and abandonment of countless evolutionary experiments. Chapter 2: American Dreams and African Reality. The Foundation Years. In December of 1816, a group of well-intentioned Americans gathered in a Washington hotel with what they believed was the solution to one of their young nation's most vexing problems. The American Colonization Society was born from the kind of meeting that probably involved a lot of earnest handshaking and the sort of optimistic planning that sounds brilliant over dinner but becomes significantly more complicated when confronted with actual geography, tropical diseases, and people who are already living quite successfully where you plan to build your utopia. The Society's membership read like a who's who of American contradictions. You had slaveholders who wanted to remove free black Americans because they feared their presence might give enslaved people inconvenient ideas about freedom. You had genuine abolitionists who believed colonization was the path to gradual emancipation. You had politicians like Henry Clay who saw an opportunity to solve America's race problem by simply relocating it to another continent. It was the kind of coalition that could only exist when everyone involved was convinced they understood what was best for people they'd never actually consulted. The Society's plan was elegantly simple in the way that plans often are when designed by people who won't be personally implementing them. They would purchase land in West Africa, transport free black Americans there, and create a colony that would serve as both refuge and example to the world. The colonists would introduce Christianity and American civilization to Africa, while escaping the racial prejudice that made their lives difficult in the United States. Everyone would benefit, the reasoning went, except presumably the Africans who were already living there, though the Society seemed confident this was a minor detail that would sort itself out. The first expedition departed New York on February 6, 1820, aboard a ship called the Elizabeth. If you've ever organised a family camping trip and watched it devolve into chaos within the first hour, you can probably imagine how well this first attempt at establishing an African colony went. 86 settlers, 3 American agents, and a ship's worth of optimistic plans sailed into what would become one of history's more sobering lessons about the gap between intention and reality. The Elizabeth headed for Sherbro Island, about 150 miles southeast of Sierra Leone, which the Society had selected based on what appeared to be thorough research, but was actually the 19th century equivalent of choosing a vacation spot based on attractive photographs, without reading the fine print about local conditions. Sherbro Island looked promising on paper. It had a natural harbour, appeared to have friendly local leadership, and was conveniently located near Sierra Leone in case things went wrong. Things went wrong almost immediately. Within 3 months, 3 of the 4 American agents had died from what they diplomatically called African fever, though it was most likely malaria combined with a lethal cocktail of other tropical diseases. 15 of the 86 colonists also died, which represented a mortality rate that would have made any modern insurance company immediately cancel everyone's policies and flee the continent. The survivors, led by a man named Daniel Coker, made the reasonable decision to abandon Sherbro Island and seek refuge in Sierra Leone, the British colony to the north that had been successfully resettling freed slaves since 1787. This was probably the first time in the colonization project's history that someone said, "You know what, maybe we should have talked to the British about how they managed to make this work," though by then it was rather late for that particular insight. The American Colonization Society, displaying the kind of institutional persistence that characterizes organizations that have invested too much to quit gracefully, decided to try again. In 1821, they sent another ship called the Nautilus, this time with additional agents and 33 more settlers who were presumably either very brave or hadn't heard about what happened to their predecessors. The new agents took one look at Sherbro Island and declared it absolutely unsuitable for human habitation, which was the kind of decisive leadership the previous expedition could have used before everyone died. This led to a search for alternative locations that involved considerable negotiation with local African leaders who had been watching these American experiments with what was probably a mixture of curiosity and concern. The Americans needed land, the Africans controlled the land, and both sides had to figure out how to communicate across cultural divides so vast that they might as well have been negotiating with extraterrestrials. Lieutenant Robert Stockton, an American naval officer who apparently believed in the negotiating power of firearms, eventually secured an agreement with a local chief known to Europeans as King Peter. The negotiation allegedly involved Stockton pointing a loaded pistol at King Peter's head while explaining the benefits of selling Cape Mesurado to the Americans. This was diplomacy in the same sense that highway robbery is a business transaction, technically successful, but establishing a precedent that would haunt relations between colonists and indigenous Africans for decades. In April of 1822, the surviving settlers from the Elizabeth, joined by new arrivals, finally established a permanent settlement on Cape Mesurado. They named their town Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe, who had provided crucial support for the colonization project. This was a nice gesture, though Monroe himself never visited his namesake city, possibly because he had observed what happened to people who travelled there and decided his contributions to Liberian history were best made from a safe distance in Washington. The early years of Monrovia were characterized by what historians politely call challenges, though barely controlled catastrophe punctuated by brief moments of hope might be more accurate. The settlers faced tropical diseases that killed them in numbers that defied both medical understanding and statistical probability. Malaria alone killed approximately 20% of all immigrants during the first generation, which made moving to Liberia roughly as dangerous as participating in a particularly lethal contact sport. The colonists also discovered that their new neighbours were not uniformly enthusiastic about sharing their land with Americans who arrived with plans to introduce civilization, Christianity, and agricultural techniques that might have worked wonderfully in Virginia, but were poorly adapted to West African soil and climate. Local African communities had been successfully managing the land for centuries, using methods that actually worked in the local environment, but the colonists arrived with the confidence of people who believed their way of doing things was universally applicable. Conflicts between colonists and indigenous Africans became a constant feature of life in early Liberia. These weren't just disputes over land rights, though those were serious enough. They were fundamental disagreements about how society should be organized, who had authority to make decisions about land use, and whether people who showed up with guns and unfamiliar customs had the right to reorganize centuries-old social structures according to their own preferences. The colonists did have some advantages beyond superior firepower. They received protection and assistance from American and British naval forces, who helped defend the settlement against attacks and occasionally provided supplies when the colonists faced starvation. This was international aid with a distinctly military flavour, the kind of support that came with warships rather than relief organisations, though it was probably more effective given the circumstances. By 1826, the colony had developed enough stability to establish some of the institutions that the colonists considered markers of civilization. They built a school, established a public library, and set up a printing press, which meant they could now educate their children, access books, and publish newspapers that complained about their living conditions in proper typeset rather than handwritten letters. These were significant achievements for a settlement that had been teetering on the edge of total collapse just a few years earlier. The colony's territorial expansion followed a pattern that would become familiar throughout the 19th century. American agents, following the aggressive example set by Yehudi Ashman, who arrived in 1822, negotiated treaties with local chiefs that acquired additional land in exchange for trade goods like tobacco, rum, gunpowder, umbrellas, iron posts, and shoes. These negotiations often involved the kind of pressure that made them less voluntary than the treaties suggested, but they provided the legal framework that allowed the colony to grow from a single settlement to a substantial territory. Ashman deserves special mention as one of those historical figures who combined genuine administrative ability with a talent for making enemies and a remarkable capacity for surviving in conditions that killed most of his contemporaries. He expanded the colony's territory, established trade relationships with the interior, and managed to keep the settlement functioning despite constant threats from disease, hostile neighbours, and the American Colonization Society's chronic inability to provide adequate financial support. He died of fever in 1828, which was probably inevitable given that he spent 6 years doing a job that seemed specifically designed to expose people to every tropical disease available. The settlers who survived the early years began to develop a distinctive society that blended American institutions with African realities. They established churches that followed American Protestant traditions, but adapted their practices to local conditions. They created a government based on American models, but had to account for the fact that they were surrounded by African communities with their own political systems. They built houses in American styles, but used local materials and hired local craftsmen who brought their own architectural traditions to the projects. Commerce gradually became the colony's lifeline. Monrovia's natural harbour made it an ideal stopping point for ships travelling along the West African coast, and the colonists discovered they could profit by serving as middlemen in trade between African interior communities and European merchants. This was probably the first time the colony generated enough income to feel genuinely optimistic about its long-term survival, though it also made them dependent on international trade networks over which they had no control. The colony attracted different types of African American emigrants over time. Some came because they genuinely believed in the colonization project and wanted to help build a new society in Africa. Others came because they were freed slaves whose former owners had made emigration to Liberia a condition of emancipation, which meant their choice was between Liberia and continued slavery. Still others came because life as free black Americans in the United States had become so difficult that even the risks of tropical colonization seemed preferable to staying. By the 1840s, the American Colonization Society found itself in an increasingly difficult financial position. The colony required constant financial support, but American interest in colonization was declining as the slavery debate intensified and the practical difficulties of the project became apparent. The society was spending more money maintaining Liberia than it was raising from donations, which is the kind of budget problem that eventually forces organizations to make dramatic changes or cease to exist. International pressure also pushed the colony toward independence. Neither Britain nor France recognized the legal status of a territory that belonged to neither the United States government nor any official American entity. This created diplomatic complications when British and French colonial authorities in neighbouring territories had disputes with Liberian colonists, because there was no clear governmental authority to resolve conflicts or negotiate treaties. The colony existed in a legal grey area that became increasingly problematic as European colonial expansion intensified along the West African coast. The push for independence came primarily from the colonists themselves, who had developed enough confidence in their ability to manage their own affairs to want formal recognition as a sovereign nation. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who became the colony's first black governor in 1841, led the movement for independence with the kind of diplomatic skill that suggested the colonists had learned important lessons about international relations since the early days of pistol point negotiations. On July 26, 1847, a group of 11 signatories declared Liberia an independent nation. The declaration was a remarkably sophisticated document that demonstrated how much the colonists' political thinking had evolved since the early days of simply trying to survive from one rainy season to the next. They had created a constitution, established governmental institutions, and developed the kind of international relationships that allowed them to function as a sovereign state. The newly independent Republic of Liberia faced the same challenges that had plagued the colony, but now they faced them without direct American Colonization Society support, and with the added responsibility of proving to the world that African Americans could successfully govern themselves. This was a significant burden for a small nation surrounded by European colonies and dealing with ongoing tensions with indigenous African communities who had never agreed to be governed by American immigrants. Looking back at these 25 years from colony to independence, the remarkable thing isn't that the project succeeded, but that anyone survived long enough to make success possible. The early colonists endured mortality rates that would be unacceptable in modern disaster zones, established settlements in one of the world's most challenging disease environments, and built working relationships with African communities, despite starting with negotiation tactics that would have been considered aggressive by Viking raiders. Chapter 3. Building a Nation, Early Independence to World War I. Independence, it turns out, was rather like finally getting your own apartment after living with roommates for years, exciting in theory, but immediately accompanied by the sobering realization that you now had to figure out how to pay all the bills yourself. When Joseph Jenkins Roberts took the oath as Liberia's first president on January 3rd, 1848, he inherited a nation that existed more on paper than in practical reality. Surrounded by neighbours who weren't entirely convinced this new country was legitimate, and facing the kind of challenges that would make even the most optimistic political scientist reach for something stronger than coffee. The constitution that Roberts swore to uphold was a remarkable document that demonstrated both the ambitions and the contradictions of the new republic. Modelled closely on the United States Constitution, it established a government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches, complete with checks and balances that looked impressive on paper. The reality was somewhat more modest. The entire government could have fit comfortably in a medium-sized meeting room, and the national budget was smaller than what many American towns spent on street maintenance. Roberts himself was an interesting choice for the role of founding president. Born free in Norfolk, Virginia, in 1809, he had arrived in Liberia in 1829 as a young man with his family, bringing the kind of commercial instincts that the struggling colony desperately needed. He established a successful trading business in Monrovia, which gave him both the wealth and the practical experience that would prove invaluable in running a country that was essentially one large, complex business venture with diplomatic complications. The new president's first priority was achieving international recognition, because a country that no one acknowledges exists faces certain practical difficulties in international commerce, diplomacy, and the general business of being a nation. Roberts embarked on what was essentially a diplomatic tour of Europe, armed with copies of Liberia's Declaration of Independence and the kind of determined optimism that characterizes people who are trying to convince the world to take their unlikely projects seriously. Great Britain was the first to extend formal recognition in 1848, which was both politically shrewd and economically practical. The British had their own colony in neighbouring Sierra Leone and understood the regional dynamics better than most. France followed with recognition, though accounts differ on whether this happened in 1848 or 1852. Suggesting either diplomatic complexity or record-keeping that was more casual than modern historians would prefer. A parade of other European nations gradually extended recognition. Portugal, the Austrian Empire, the German cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, the Kingdom of Sardinia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and even Brazil. It was like a very slow and formal version of making friends at a new school, where each new recognition made it easier to convince the next country that Liberia was worth acknowledging as a legitimate member of the international community. The United States, remarkably, withheld recognition until 1862 during the Civil War. The official explanation involved concerns about the political and social status of black diplomats in Washington, D.C., though the more practical reality was that Southern congressmen had consistently blocked recognition of a black republic. It took the secession of the Southern states to remove this political obstacle, which must have struck Liberian officials as ironic timing at best. While Roberts was busy with international diplomacy, the domestic situation presented challenges that would have overwhelmed anyone, lacking both exceptional diplomatic skills and a very high tolerance for managing competing interests. The Americo-Liberian settlers, numbering perhaps 15,000 at most, They found themselves governing a territory inhabited by approximately 750,000 indigenous Africans who had not asked to be governed by anyone, much less by people who had arrived from another continent with unfamiliar customs and determined ideas about proper civilization. The indigenous peoples of Liberia belonged to numerous ethnic groups, each with their own political systems, cultural traditions, and understandable skepticism about the new republic's authority. The coastal Kru and Grebo peoples were particularly resistant to Americo-Liberian control, having developed their own successful trading relationships with European merchants over centuries. They saw no compelling reason to surrender their economic autonomy to a government in Monrovia that seemed primarily interested in collecting taxes and imposing regulations on trade networks that had functioned perfectly well without interference. The Kru people, who lived along the southern coast, had earned a reputation as exceptional sailors and were employed by European ships throughout West Africa. They had developed such a strong sense of ethnic identity and resistance to outside control that European slavers had largely given up trying to enslave them. When faced with Americo-Liberian authority, they approached the situation with the same stubborn independence that had frustrated slave traders, which made for colourful politics but difficult governance. The Grebo people, living along the coast in what became Maryland County, presented similar challenges. When the Republic of Maryland, the separate colony established by Maryland's State Colonization Society, requested military assistance from Liberia in 1856 to suppress Grebo and Kru resistance to settler control, overtrade, Roberts faced his first major test as a military leader. The joint campaign succeeded, and Maryland joined Liberia as Maryland County in 1857, but the victory established a pattern of using military force to resolve disputes with indigenous populations that would characterize Liberian politics for decades. The economic foundation of the new republic was precarious in ways that would make modern economists deeply nervous. Government revenue depended heavily on customs duties, which meant the state's financial survival required maintaining control over ports and trade routes. This created immediate conflicts with indigenous traders who had been conducting business directly with European merchants for generations and saw no reason why they should pay taxes to a government they didn't recognize for services they didn't want. Coffee became one of Liberia's most important export crops during the early independence period, and for a brief time it seemed like the foundation of economic prosperity. Liberian coffee was well regarded in international markets, and the climate proved ideal for cultivation. However, the emergence of Brazilian coffee production in the 1870s destroyed Liberia's comparative advantage with the efficiency of an economic hurricane, leaving coffee farmers struggling to compete with producers who had larger operations, better transportation networks, and lower production costs. Agriculture in general faced challenges that would have frustrated anyone trying to apply American farming techniques to West African conditions. The country lacked draft animals because of trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, which was fatal to cattle and horses. This meant that farming remained largely dependent on human labour, without the animal-drawn ploughs that were common in the United States. Liberian farmers had to develop techniques adapted to local conditions, often learning from indigenous communities who had centuries of experience with the soil and climate. The territorial expansion of the Republic followed a pattern that combined legal treaties with military pressure in proportions that varied depending on the circumstances and the negotiating skills of the parties involved. During Roberts' presidency, Liberia's borders expanded to include a 600-mile coastline through a series of agreements with local African leaders. These treaties typically involve payment of trade goods, tobacco, rum, gunpowder, umbrellas, iron posts, and shoes in exchange for land rights, though the concept of land ownership often meant different things to the different parties involved. The establishment of Liberia College in 1862 represented one of the new republic's most ambitious attempts to build the institutions of a modern state. Roberts co-founded the college and served as its first president, traveling regularly to the United States to raise funds for the institution. The college was intended to educate both Americo-Liberian and indigenous students, though in practice the student body remained predominantly Americo-Liberian for most of the 19th century. The curriculum emphasized classical education, which may not have been the most practical approach for a developing country, but reflected the founders' determination to prove that African Americans could achieve the highest standards of Western education. Political development in the early republic was dominated by two parties that represented different factions within the Americo-Liberian community. The Republican Party, later called the Liberian Party, drew support primarily from mixed-race African Americans from poorer backgrounds, while the true Whig Party attracted support from wealthier settlers. The franchise was limited to prevent indigenous Liberians from voting, which created a political system where a tiny minority governed a large majority who had no voice in the electoral process. This was democratic in the same sense that a club is democratic among its members while excluding everyone else from membership. The Republic Party dominated politics from the first presidential election in 1847, using its position to suppress opposition in ways that would make modern political scientists write concerned papers about democratic backsliding. In 1869, however, the true Whigs managed to elect Edward James Roy as president, breaking Republican control. Roy's presidency lasted only 2 years before he was deposed in a coup, demonstrating that Liberian politics had acquired the kind of volatility that characterized many young republics. The issue of the foreign loan negotiated in 1871 during Roy's presidency deserves particular attention as an early example of the challenges small nations face in international finance. The loan was nominally for £100,000, negotiated in London, but the terms were so unfavourable that Liberia received significantly less than the face value while being obligated to repay the full amount with interest. This was international lending in the same sense that loan sharking is lending, technically legal but designed to benefit the lender far more than the borrower. The true Whigs regained power in 1878 and maintained control for the next century, creating what was essentially a one-party state disguised as a democracy. This political monopoly provided stability, but at the cost of political competition and representation for the indigenous majority. The true Whig Party developed into the kind of political organisation that controlled every aspect of government, while presenting itself as the natural and inevitable choice for leadership. Throughout this period, conflicts with indigenous populations remained a constant feature of Liberian politics. The 1870s saw the Gabibo Reunited Kingdom Revolution, an attempt by the Gribo people to establish their own independent state that lasted from 1875 to 1876. This rebellion was serious enough to prompt intervention by the United States, which sent the USS Alaska to Liberian waters as a show of force. The Gribo eventually signed a peace treaty acknowledging Liberian authority, but the conflict demonstrated the ongoing tension between the settler government and indigenous communities. The Kru people proved equally resistant to Liberian authority, staging uprisings in 1855 and again in 1893. The government's response typically involved military force supported by American assistance, establishing a pattern where Liberian sovereignty was maintained partly through foreign intervention. This was independence in the technical sense, but it relied on American support in ways that complicated the Republic's claims to full autonomy. European colonial expansion in West Africa during the late 19th century created new pressures for Liberia that required constant diplomatic maneuvering to maintain independence. Britain and France were carving up the region into colonies, and Liberia's borders were subject to frequent encroachment and disputes. The country's survival as an independent nation required careful navigation of European power politics while maintaining American support and managing domestic tensions. The economic challenges of this period were compounded by technological changes that made Liberian shipping companies less competitive. European advances in steam technology and changes in global trade routes gradually drove Liberian merchants out of businesses they had dominated during the earlier decades of independence. The country increasingly found itself dependent on foreign investment and assistance, which limited its economic autonomy even as it maintained political independence. The development of infrastructure during this period was slow and often frustrated by the country's financial limitations. Roads remained primitive, limiting internal trade and communication. The establishment of telegraph communications and improved harbour facilities represented significant advances, but these projects required foreign investment that came with conditions and obligations that constrained government policy. By the turn of the 20th century, Liberia had evolved into a functioning state, but one with fundamental structural problems that would persist for decades. The political system excluded the indigenous majority, creating ongoing tensions and instability. The economy remained dependent on a few export commodities and foreign investment, making the country vulnerable to external economic shocks. The government's authority over the interior remained limited and depended on military force rather than popular consent. Looking back at the first 70 years of Liberian independence, the remarkable achievement was not that the Republic solved all its problems, but that it survived as an independent nation at all. In an era when European powers were colonizing most of Africa, Liberia maintained its sovereignty through a combination of American support, diplomatic skill, and the determination of its leaders to preserve independence despite overwhelming challenges. Chapter 4. Between Two Worlds, Interwar Period and World War II. If the first 70 years of Liberian independence could be described as learning to walk while carrying a very heavy backpack, the period between the world wars was like finally getting that backpack off, only to discover that someone had attached a much larger and more complicated piece of equipment that came with an instruction manual written entirely in corporate legalese. The interwar years brought Liberia face to face with 20th century global capitalism in the form of Harvey Samuel Firestone and his rubber empire, a encounter that would reshape the nation in ways both profound and troubling. By 1920, the global rubber market had become something of a European monopoly, with Britain and the Netherlands controlling most of the world's natural rubber production through their colonial plantations in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. This situation made American manufacturers deeply uncomfortable, particularly as the automobile industry boomed and tire production became increasingly crucial to the American economy. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce and later President, identified rubber as a strategic vulnerability that needed immediate attention. Harvey Firestone, founder of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, was among those who understood that America's rubber dependence represented both a national security issue and a business opportunity. In December of 1923, he sent experts to Liberia to conduct soil surveys, initiating what would become one of the most consequential business agreements in African history. The choice of Liberia was logical from several perspectives. It had the right climate for rubber cultivation, it was politically independent, and it was desperately in need of investment capital. The negotiations that led to the 1926 concession agreement were conducted between parties with vastly unequal bargaining power, rather like a poker game where one player has a full house and the other is hoping no one notices they're holding a handful of coupons from a restaurant that closed last year. Liberia's government was drowning in debt, particularly to British lenders, and facing constant pressure from European colonial powers who seemed to view Liberian independence as a temporary inconvenience. The final agreement, signed in 1926, granted Firestone a 99-year lease on up to 1 million acres of Liberian territory at the remarkably low price of 6 cents per acre. To put this in perspective, 6 cents per acre in 1926 money would be roughly equivalent to paying about 80 cents per acre today for land that would now be worth thousands of dollars per acre. The deal also included a $5 million loan from Firestone to the Liberian government, which Harvey Firestone had inserted as a last-minute addition to tie American government interest to his company's investment. The scale of Firestone's ambitions was breathtaking, in ways that would make modern development economists reach for strong medication. The company originally planned to employ 350,000 people on the rubber plantations, which was more than the total number of able-bodied men in the entire country at the time. This was workforce planning in the same sense that planning to host a dinner party for 50 people in a studio apartment is meal planning. Technically possible if you're willing to redefine some basic concepts about space and logistics. To meet these impossible labour quotas, the Liberian government implemented a system that would have been familiar to anyone who understood how colonial labour recruitment worked elsewhere in Africa. Local chieftains were given quotas for workers that were deliberately set too high to meet through voluntary recruitment, creating pressure to use various forms of coercion to supply the plantation with workers. This was labour recruitment in the same sense that military conscription is career counselling, technically about providing employment opportunities, but with a distinctly involuntary character. The plantation that emerged around the town of Harbel became a kind of corporate state within a state, complete with its own infrastructure, housing, schools and medical facilities. Firestone constructed roads, established a hydroelectric power plant, built a hospital, and created what was essentially a company town that functioned according to American business practices rather than Liberian law. The irony was striking. In a country founded by people escaping American racial oppression, Firestone had recreated many of the same segregated social structures, complete with white-only facilities that even excluded black Liberian government officials. The economic impact of the Firestone operation was both transformative and problematic. On one hand, the plantation provided employment for thousands of Liberians and generated government revenue through taxes and fees. On the other hand, it created a dual economy where a modern, capital-intensive agricultural operation existed alongside traditional subsistence farming, with limited integration between the two sectors. It was economic development in the same sense that building a modern factory in the middle of a medieval village is urban planning, technically progress, but progress that created as many problems as it solved. The Great Depression hit Liberia particularly hard, demonstrating the risks of depending on commodity exports and foreign investment. As rubber prices collapsed, Firestone scaled back operations dramatically, using only 50,000 of the million acres it had leased and cutting wages in half. The company's reduced operations deprived the Liberian government of expected tax revenues, leading to missed payments on the Firestone loan and a financial crisis that threatened the country's sovereignty. Harvey Firestone's response to Liberia's financial difficulties revealed the extent to which the plantation had become a tool of American economic imperialism. He asked the United States government to send a warship to Monrovia to enforce debt collection, essentially requesting gunboat diplomacy to protect his investment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt refused this request, writing memorably that Firestone had gone to Liberia at his own financial risk and it was not the State Department's job to pull his financial chestnut out of the fire. The crisis was eventually resolved through intervention by the League of Nations, which proposed a plan of assistance that would place international advisors in key positions within the Liberian government. This was sovereignty in the same sense that being allowed to choose your own bedtime while your parents control your allowance is independence. Technically autonomous, but with significant external oversight of crucial decisions. World War II transformed Liberia's strategic importance in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. When Japanese forces captured the rubber-producing regions of Southeast Asia, Liberia suddenly became one of the few sources of natural rubber available to the Allied war effort. The Firestone plantation, which had been a symbol of economic exploitation, became a crucial strategic asset in the fight against fascism, demonstrating how global events could completely reframe local relationships. In 1942, Liberia signed a defense agreement with the United States that brought American military personnel and resources to the country on a scale never before seen. The agreement included the construction of Roberts Field, an airport with runways long enough to accommodate large military aircraft and serve as a crucial link in the South Atlantic air ferry route between South America and North Africa. German U-boats had made North Atlantic shipping too dangerous, so the South American-Liberian air corridor became vital for transporting troops and supplies to the war in North Africa. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's visit to Liberia in January 1943 was a historic moment that symbolized the transformation of American-Liberian relations. Roosevelt flew to Roberts Field directly from the Casablanca Conference with Winston Churchill, demonstrating Liberia's new strategic importance. The sight of the President of the United States meeting with President Edwin Barclay on equal terms at Roberts Field must have been particularly meaningful for a country that had struggled for decades to gain international recognition, respect. The wartime relationship brought both benefits and complications for Liberia. American construction projects improved the country's infrastructure dramatically, creating roads, airport facilities, and communication networks that had never existed before. The declaration of the US dollar as legal tender in Liberia in 1943 replaced British West African currency and tied the Liberian economy more closely to American monetary policy. These were the kind of changes that made Liberia more modern and prosperous, but also more dependent on American economic conditions. The labor conditions on the Firestone plantation during this period remained a source of tension and conflict. Workers faced dangerous working conditions, inadequate housing, and wages that barely covered subsistence needs. Between 1945 and 1950, plantation workers staged multiple strikes and uprisings, demanding better wages and working conditions. The Liberian government, led by President William V. S. Tubman, typically supported Firestone's interests over those of the workers, using military force to suppress labor unrest. The contradictions of wartime Liberia were epitomized by the segregated nature of the Firestone plantation, where American racism was exported to African soil in the name of supporting the war against fascism. Black American diplomats and Liberian government officials were excluded from white-only facilities at the plantation, creating the surreal situation where representatives of the government that had granted the concession were treated as second-class citizens on their own territory. Liberia's formal declaration of war on Germany and Japan in January 1944 was largely symbolic, but it demonstrated the country's commitment to the Allied cause. The Liberian Frontier Force offered to send units to Europe, though this offer was not accepted. Instead, Liberia's contribution to the war effort came through rubber production, strategic facilities, and the symbolic importance of having an independent African nation firmly aligned with the democratic allies. The social impact of the wartime changes was profound and lasting. The construction of Roberts Field and the expansion of American operations brought thousands of Americans to Liberia, exposing Liberians to new technologies, ideas, and ways of organizing society. The experience of working with American military and civilian personnel during the war created a generation of Liberians who were more familiar with American culture and more integrated into global economic networks. The displacement of indigenous communities to make way for plantation operations represented one of the most troubling aspects of the Firestone era. Entire Bassa communities were forced to relocate, often without adequate compensation, to make room for rubber trees and plantation infrastructure. The new settlement they established was given the Bassa name Quizan, which translates roughly as, "White people told us to leave this place," a place name that serves as a permanent reminder of the human cost of economic development. President Edwin Barclay, who had guided Liberia through both the Great Depression and World War II, represented the kind of leadership that the country needed during this period of dramatic change. His ability to navigate between American demands, indigenous concerns, and international pressures demonstrated the sophisticated diplomacy required to maintain sovereignty while accepting extensive foreign involvement in the national economy. The economic legacy of the interwar period was mixed in ways that would characterize Liberian development for decades to come. The Firestone plantation provided employment and government revenue, but it also created economic dependence on a single crop exported to a single market. The infrastructure built during the war improved transportation and communication, but it was designed primarily to serve American strategic interests rather than Liberian development needs. By 1945, Liberia had been transformed from a small, relatively isolated West African republic into a strategic partner of the United States and a key player in global rubber production. The changes brought undeniable benefits: better infrastructure, increased government revenues, improved international standing, and greater integration into global economic networks. However, these benefits came at the cost of increased dependence on foreign investment and American political support, creating vulnerabilities that would become apparent in later decades. The wartime experience also highlighted the continuing tensions within Liberian society between the Americo-Liberian minority that controlled the government and the indigenous majority that provided most of the labour for economic development projects. The Firestone plantation employed thousands of indigenous workers under conditions that were often exploitative, while the benefits of increased government revenue flowed primarily to the settler elite who controlled political power. As the war ended and American forces began withdrawing from Liberia in February 1946, the country faced the challenge of maintaining the wartime gains while developing more sustainable and equitable approaches to economic development. The Firestone plantation remained, as did the expanded infrastructure and closer ties with the United States. But the special circumstances that had made Liberia strategically crucial were ending. Looking back at the period from 1918 to 1945, the most striking aspect may be how external forces, global rubber markets, American strategic needs, World War, shaped Liberian development in ways that had little to do with local preferences or priorities. The country had achieved greater prosperity and international prominence, but at the cost of becoming more deeply embedded in global economic and political systems over which it had limited control. Chapter 5: Independence Struggles and Civil Wars, Modern Turbulence. The period following World War II began with what looked like Liberia's golden age, a time when the country seemed poised to become a model for African development and prosperity. William V.S. Tubman, who assumed the presidency in 1944, embarked on an ambitious modernization program that would transform Liberia from a sleepy backwater into what appeared to be one of Africa's great success stories. It was the kind of transformation that made development economists write optimistic papers, though, as we'll see, the foundations of this prosperity were perhaps not as solid as they appeared from a distance. Tubman's approach to governance was built on two cardinal policies that sounded impressive in policy documents and actually worked reasonably well in practice, at least for a while. The open door policy encouraged foreign investment and trade, while the national unification policy aimed to bridge the historic divide between Americo-Liberians and indigenous populations. This was nation-building in the same sense that urban planning is architecture: theoretically sound, practically complex, and heavily dependent on getting the details right. The economic results were genuinely remarkable. Between 1944 and 1970, foreign investment increased by over 200%, mostly from the United States, but also from Germany and Sweden. During the 1950s, Liberia experienced an average annual growth rate of 11.5%, making it the world's second fastest growing economy. This was the kind of economic performance that made other developing countries envious, and international observers confident that Liberia had discovered the secret to successful African modernization. Tubman's modernization efforts were visible in ways that impressed both Liberians and foreign visitors. The streets of Monrovia were paved, a public sanitation system was installed, hospitals were built, and a literacy program was launched. Roads and railroads connected the interior to the capital for the first time, opening up regions that had been isolated since the country's founding. The port of Monrovia was expanded and modernized, while the establishment of a flag of convenience program brought in substantial revenue from international shipping companies who found it cheaper to register their vessels under the Liberian flag. The diversification of the economy beyond rubber was particularly significant. Swedish, German, and American companies became involved in iron ore mining, making Liberia the leading source of iron in Africa and the fourth worldwide. This was economic development that looked sustainable and sophisticated, based on natural resources but not dependent on a single commodity export. For the first time in the country's history, the government budget showed consistent surpluses rather than the chronic deficits that had characterized earlier periods. Tubman's efforts at national unification represented a genuine attempt to address the fundamental divisions that had plagued Liberian society since independence. Indigenous Liberians were gradually granted voting rights and allowed to participate in government, though this integration was carefully controlled and limited. It was democratic reform in the same sense that gradual income increases are wealth redistribution, technically progressive, but operating within existing power structures rather than fundamentally challenging them. On the international stage, Tubman emerged as one of Africa's most prominent statesmen during the continent's decolonization period. When he began his presidency in 1944, only 4 independent states existed in Africa: Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Liberia. By his death in 1971, there were 40 independent African nations. Tubman played a crucial role in establishing the Organization of African Unity in 1963 and frequently mediated disputes between newly independent African states. However, the apparent success contained seeds of future problems. The true Whig Party maintained its monopoly through increasingly authoritarian methods. Tubman changed the constitution to allow himself 7 consecutive terms, gagged the press, and established government informants that made opposition dangerous. This was stability like a pressure cooker, functional as long as the lid stays on, but potentially explosive. When Tubman died in July 1971, William Talbot inherited both achievements and contradictions. Talbot attempted to liberalize while maintaining Americo-Liberian dominance, allowing formation of the Progressive Alliance of Liberia in 1973. This was democratic reform like choosing between two flavors. Technically improvement, but quite limited. Talbot's foreign policy departed significantly from Tubman's pro-Western alignment. He established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and several Eastern Bloc countries, adopting a non-aligned stance that reflected the broader trends in Third World politics during the 1970s. This shift strained relations with the United States, which had grown accustomed to Liberian support during the Cold War and was uncomfortable with Monrovia's new diplomatic independence. The economic situation during the Talbot years became increasingly problematic. World rubber prices declined throughout the 1970s, putting pressure on government revenues and highlighting the country's continued dependence on commodity exports. Talbot responded by demanding audits of foreign companies like Firestone, which had operated without government oversight for decades, and forcing them to pay millions of dollars in back taxes. This was economic sovereignty in practice, though it created tensions with the same foreign investors whose capital had fueled the country's growth. The growing economic difficulties contributed to social tensions that had been building beneath the surface of the Tubman-era prosperity. Despite decades of national unification policies, the fundamental inequalities between Americo-Liberians and indigenous populations remained largely unchanged. The Americo-Liberian minority, perhaps 5% of the population, continued to control the government, the economy, and most opportunities for advancement, while the indigenous majority remained largely excluded from political power and economic benefits. The crisis that would end 133 years of Americo-Liberian rule began with rice prices. In April 1979, the government proposed increasing subsidized rice from $22 to $26 per 100-pound bag. The Progressive Alliance called for peaceful protest, but on April 14th, the demonstration grew violent, becoming the Rice Riots, the first widespread civil violence since independence. Talbot's response to the riots damaged his credibility and revealed the fragility of the political system he was trying to reform. Rather than addressing the underlying economic grievances, he ordered the arrest of opposition leaders and declared that protests threatened national security. This was crisis management in the same sense that locking the doors is fire prevention. It might contain the immediate problem, but it doesn't address the underlying causes. The military coup that ended the Talbot presidency came with shocking swiftness and brutality. In the early hours of April 12, 1980, 17 non-commissioned officers and soldiers of the Armed Forces of Liberia, led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, launched a violent assault on the executive mansion. All of the coup leaders were indigenous Liberians, members of various ethnic groups who had been excluded from political power since the country's founding. President Talbot was killed during the attack, along with 27 other government officials and family members. The ease with which the coup succeeded reflected both the weakness of the Americo-Liberian political system and the depth of resentment that had built up among the indigenous population. This was political revolution in the most literal sense, a complete overturning of the existing order by people who had been systematically excluded from it. The aftermath of the coup was marked by scenes of violence that shocked even seasoned observers of African politics. 13 members of Talbot's cabinet were publicly tried and executed on the beach near Monrovia on April 22, 1980. Crowds of jubilant indigenous Liberians gathered to watch these executions, shouting insults and throwing stones at the condemned men. The executions were televised. turning what had been private political violence into a public spectacle of revenge against the former ruling class. Samuel Doe, who emerged as the leader of the People's Redemption Council that assumed power after the coup, was 29 years old and had limited formal education or experience in government. He was a member of the Kran ethnic group, one of the indigenous communities that had been marginalized under Americo-Liberian rule. His rise to power represented a complete reversal of Liberia's traditional political hierarchy, though whether this reversal would lead to better governance remained to be seen. The international response to the coup was complicated by Cold War considerations. The United States, despite its long relationship with Liberia's Americo-Liberian leadership, gradually came to support Doe's regime because of his strong anti-communist stance. This was pragmatic diplomacy in the same sense that supporting the enemy of your enemy is alliance building, strategically logical, but not necessarily based on shared values or democratic principles. Doe's rule quickly became characterized by the same authoritarian tendencies and ethnic favoritism that had marked previous Liberian governments, though now the favored group was the Kran rather than the Americo-Liberians. Government positions were distributed based on ethnic loyalty rather than competence, while political opposition was suppressed through imprisonment, exile, or worse. This was democratization in reverse, replacing one form of exclusive rule with another, equally exclusive system. The fraudulent elections of 1985, in which Doe declared himself the winner despite clear evidence that he had lost, further undermined the legitimacy of his government. International observers widely rejected the results, but the United States continued its support because of Doe's alignment with American Cold War objectives. This created a situation where a government with little domestic legitimacy maintained power primarily through foreign support and military force. By the late 1980s, opposition to Doe's regime was growing both within Liberia and among exile communities. Charles Taylor, a former government official who had fled the country after being accused of embezzling funds, began organizing an armed resistance movement with support from Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Taylor represented yet another reversal of Liberian political patterns, an Americo-Liberian attempting to overthrow an indigenous government, though his rebel movement included fighters from various ethnic backgrounds. The First Liberian Civil War began on Christmas Eve, 1989, when Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia invaded the country from Côte d'Ivoire. The conflict quickly became characterized by extreme brutality, ethnic violence, and the use of child soldiers. This was warfare that combined modern weapons with traditional ethnic rivalries, creating a level of violence that horrified international observers and devastated the Liberian population. The civil war fragmented into multiple factions as different ethnic and regional groups formed their own militias. Prince Johnson's Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia broke away from Taylor's organization, while various other groups emerged to defend particular communities or pursue specific agendas. What had begun as a straightforward rebellion against Doe's government became a complex, multi-sided conflict with shifting alliances and competing claims to legitimacy. Samuel Doe was captured and executed by Prince Johnson's forces in September 1990, an event that was videotaped and widely circulated. The graphic nature of Doe's torture and murder reflected the brutalization of Liberian society that the Civil War had produced. Political violence had moved far beyond the targeted assassinations of the 1980 coup to become a generalized pattern of ethnic revenge and personal cruelty. The international response to the Liberian Civil War came primarily through the Economic Community of West African States, which deployed a peacekeeping force known as ECOMOG. This was regional conflict resolution in practice, with neighbouring West African countries attempting to restore stability through military intervention However, the peacekeeping mission became entangled in the conflict itself, as different factions viewed Ecomog as supporting their rivals rather than maintaining genuine neutrality. The human cost of the First Liberian Civil War was staggering. Over 150,000 people died, while approximately two-thirds of the population was displaced either internally or as refugees in neighbouring countries. The economic infrastructure that had been built up during the Tubman years was largely destroyed, and the social fabric that had held the country together was torn apart by ethnic violence and personal revenge. A fragile peace agreement was reached in 1996, followed by elections in 1997 that brought Charles Taylor to the presidency. Taylor's victory was partly based on voters' fear that he would resume the war if he lost, demonstrating how thoroughly violence had become integrated into the political process. This was democracy at gunpoint, technically legitimate elections, but held under circumstances that made genuine choice difficult. Taylor's presidency proved to be only a temporary respite from conflict. By the end of 1999, new rebel groups were attacking government forces in northern Liberia, beginning what would become known as the Second Liberian Civil War. The cycle of violence that had begun with the rice riots of 1979 continued to spiral through different phases, each more destructive than the last. Looking back at this period from 1945 to 2003, the trajectory from prosperity to chaos seems almost inevitable in retrospect, though it certainly didn't feel that way to people living through it. The Tubman-era prosperity had been built on foundations that proved less solid than they appeared: political exclusion, economic dependence on foreign investment, and social divisions that modernization had masked rather than resolved. When these underlying problems finally erupted into violence, they did so with a force that swept away not just governments but the basic institutions of civilized society. Chapter 6: Rebuilding the Dream, Contemporary Liberia. By August 2003, Charles Taylor had become something of a pariah on the international stage, like that friend who keeps borrowing money and never paying it back. Except, instead of money, it was war crimes, and instead of friends, it was neighbouring countries trying to maintain basic stability. The pressure on Taylor from multiple directions, rebel forces advancing on Monrovia, international war crimes charges, and American diplomatic intervention, finally convinced him that exile in Nigeria might be preferable to whatever alternative awaited him in Liberia. Taylor's resignation on August 11, 2003, marked the end of the Second Liberian Civil War and the beginning of what would prove to be Liberia's most successful attempt at post-conflict reconstruction. Unlike previous transitions that had been managed primarily by Liberians themselves, this time the international community stepped in with unprecedented commitment and resources. The United Nations mission in Liberia, known as UNMIL, deployed 15,000 peacekeeping troops to maintain security, while a transitional government prepared for democratic elections. The National Transitional Government was headed by Gude Bryant, a Liberian businessman who was chosen precisely because he had managed to avoid becoming deeply involved in the country's various conflicts. This was leadership selection in the same sense that choosing a referee for a boxing match. You want someone who hasn't been punching anyone and isn't planning to start. Bryant's government had the unenviable task of preparing for elections while managing a country where basic infrastructure had been destroyed, government institutions had collapsed, and different ethnic groups remained deeply suspicious of each other. Into this challenging environment came Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who returned to Liberia in 2003 to chair the Governance Reform Commission of the Transitional Government. Johnson Sirleaf brought with her an unusual combination of credentials. She was both an indigenous Liberian and a Harvard-trained economist, both a victim of political persecution and an experienced international civil servant. Her career had included stints at the World Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, and Citibank, making her perhaps the only Liberian politician who could discuss microfinance policy with equal facility in English Angola. The 2005 presidential election represented Liberia's first genuinely free and fair democratic contest in decades. The campaign featured 22 candidates, including Johnson Sirleaf for the Unity Party and George Weah, the world-famous footballer who had become a political novice but commanded enormous popular support. The election itself became a contest between experience and celebrity, between technocratic competence and emotional connection with ordinary Liberians. Weah won the first round of voting with about 38%, while Johnson Sirleaf finished second with approximately 20%. The runoff campaign was intense, with Johnson Sirleaf emphasizing her experience in government and international finance, while Weah highlighted his connection to young Liberians and his understanding of poverty. Johnson Sirleaf ultimately won the runoff with 59% of the vote, becoming both Liberia's 24th president and Africa's first elected female head of state. Johnson Sirleaf's inauguration on January 16, 2006, marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most stable and successful period in Liberian governance since the Tubman era. Her presidency faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most leaders. The country was essentially bankrupt, infrastructure was destroyed, institutions had collapsed, and international confidence in Liberian leadership was at historic lows. It was like being asked to rebuild a house that had been hit by multiple hurricanes while the contractors were still arguing about who was responsible for the original damage. One of Johnson Sirleaf's first major achievements was negotiating complete forgiveness of Liberia's external debt, which had reached unsustainable levels during the years of conflict and misrule. The debt relief process required extensive negotiations with international creditors and demonstration of good governance practices, but by 2010, Liberia had achieved complete debt cancellation. This was financial diplomacy at its most successful, convincing creditors that forgiving old debts was the best way to ensure future stability and repayment capacity. Johnson Sirleaf also managed to attract over $16 billion in foreign investment during her presidency, primarily in mining, agriculture, and forestry sectors. These investments represented a vote of international confidence in Liberian stability that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. However, the investments also raised questions about whether ordinary Liberians would benefit from the resource extraction, or whether the wealth would remain concentrated among elites and foreign investors. The establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2006 represented an attempt to address the legacy of Civil War atrocities and promote national healing. The Commission's work was controversial, particularly its recommendation that Johnson Sirleaf herself be barred from public office for 30 years because of her early financial support for Charles Taylor's rebellion. This created an awkward situation where the president was censured by the very reconciliation process she had established, though she ultimately ignored the recommendation and continued serving. Johnson Sirleaf's approach to corruption represented a significant break with previous Liberian leadership practices. She fired the entire staff of the Ministry of Finance upon taking office and promised to investigate and prosecute anyone responsible for graft. While corruption didn't disappear entirely, the culture of impunity that had characterized previous administrations was significantly reduced. This was anti-corruption work in the same sense that changing the locks is home security. Not foolproof, but a clear signal that the old ways of doing business were no longer acceptable. The most severe test of Johnson Sirleaf's leadership came with the Ebola epidemic that struck West Africa in 2014. Liberia was the hardest hit country, with over 4,800 deaths in a nation of fewer than 5 million people. The epidemic devastated the already fragile healthcare system and caused severe economic disruption as international travel and investment dried up. Johnson Sirleaf's response to the crisis, including cooperation with international health agencies and implementation of quarantine measures, was credited with eventually containing the outbreak. Johnson Sirleaf's recognition on the international stage culminated in her sharing the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize with WWII and Tawakkul Karman for their work advancing women's rights, peace building. The award brought international attention to Liberian progress and Johnson Sirleaf's role in the country's transformation, though some Liberians questioned whether the international recognition matched the reality of life for ordinary citizens who continued to struggle with poverty and limited opportunities. By 2017, Johnson Sirleaf had completed 2 full terms as president, and in keeping with Liberian constitutional limits, was required to step down. Her decision to support George Weah over her own vice president, Joseph Boakai, surprised many observers and created tensions within her unity party. However, it may have reflected her belief that Weah's popularity was irresistible and that supporting him would ensure a peaceful transition rather than contested results. George Weah's victory in the 2017 election represented another historic moment for Liberia, the first peaceful democratic transfer of power from one party to another since 1944. Weah brought to the presidency enormous popular support, particularly among young Liberians who had grown up watching him dominate world football. However, he also brought limited experience in government and economic management, having never held executive office higher than senator. Weah's inauguration on January 22, 2018, at the Samuel Canyon Doe Sports Complex, rather than the traditional Capitol grounds, symbolized his connection to ordinary Liberians and his break with elite political traditions. His speech emphasized fighting corruption, reforming the economy, and improving education, goals that echoed those of his predecessors, but carried the promise of a leader who understood poverty from personal experience. However, Weah's presidency quickly encountered economic difficulties that would define much of his time in office. Within months of taking power, Liberia experienced severe currency depreciation, with the Liberian dollar losing approximately 50% of its value against the US dollar. This created immediate hardship for ordinary Liberians, who suddenly found basic commodities like rice and cooking oil beyond their reach. The currency crisis was economic management in reverse. Instead of creating prosperity, government policies seemed to be making everyone poorer. The missing banknotes scandal that emerged 9 months into Weah's presidency severely damaged his credibility on corruption issues. Approximately $15.5 billion Liberian dollars, worth about $96 million US dollars at the time, in newly printed currency could not be properly accounted for. An investigation revealed that the money had not disappeared, but had been illegally printed without proper authorization, representing about 5% of the country's entire gross domestic product. This was financial mismanagement on a scale that made previous corruption scandals look like accounting errors. Weah's response to economic challenges often seemed to create additional problems rather than solutions. His injection of $25 million US dollars into the economy to combat inflation led to questions about proper procedures and accounting. His appointments included individuals with questionable track records, including some associated with the Taylor regime, which raised concerns about whether he was serious about breaking with past practices of corruption and poor governance. The COVID-19 pandemic, which reached Liberia in 2020, created additional economic pressures for the Weah administration. While the country avoided the massive death tolls seen in some other nations, the economic disruption was severe. International aid, which had been declining since the end of the UN peacekeeping mission, fell further as donor countries focused on their own pandemic responses. This was crisis management during a crisis, trying to solve existing problems while dealing with new emergencies. By 2023, Weah faced an electorate that was deeply dissatisfied with his economic performance despite some achievements in infrastructure, development and education policy. Inflation had reached 30% at its peak, unemployment remained high, and basic services continued to be inadequate for most Liberians. The Save the State protests that had emerged during his presidency demonstrated growing frustration with economic conditions and governance failures. The 2023 election represented another test of Liberian democracy and Weah's popularity. Despite his famous name and continued charisma, Weah found himself increasingly unpopular as economic conditions worsened and corruption scandals multiplied. The election became a referendum on whether celebrity and good intentions were sufficient qualifications for leadership, or whether Liberians preferred more experienced governance during difficult economic times. Joseph Boakai, Johnson Sirleaf's former vice president, emerged as Weah's main challenger in 2023, representing continuity with the relative stability of the Johnson Sirleaf era. The election results showed that Liberians had decided that experience mattered more than celebrity. Boakai won with approximately 51% of the vote, making Weah the first Liberian president to lose a re-election bid since the restoration of democracy. As Liberia moves forward under Boakai's leadership, the country faces challenges that have persisted throughout its modern history. The economy remains dependent on commodity exports and vulnerable to global price fluctuations. Infrastructure, while improved from the post-war period, still requires massive investment. The healthcare system, devastated by Ebola and strained by COVID-19, needs fundamental rebuilding. Education, despite policy improvements, still fails to prepare most Liberians for economic opportunities in a changing world. Perhaps most fundamentally, Liberia continues to grapple with the challenge of building genuine national unity across ethnic, regional, and class divisions that have persisted since the country's founding. The legacy of settler domination, military rule, civil war, and elite capture of resources has created deep skepticism about whether political leaders can truly serve the interests of ordinary Liberians rather than their own networks and supporters. Yet there are also reasons for cautious optimism about Liberia's future. The country has now experienced multiple peaceful transfers of power, suggesting that democratic institutions are becoming more robust. The international community remains engaged, though with more realistic expectations about the pace of development. A new generation of Liberians, educated both locally and internationally, is beginning to take on leadership roles in business, civil society, and government. Looking back at the period from 2003 to the present, Liberia's journey from failed state to functioning democracy represents a remarkable achievement, even if the final destination remains distant. The country has avoided the complete collapse that seemed possible during the worst years of civil war, and has built institutions that, while imperfect, provide hope for continued progress. Whether that progress will be sufficient to meet the aspirations of Liberians who have waited patiently for the benefits of peace and democracy remains one of the great questions of contemporary African development.